So let's open up Unreal or just follow along. I put some files in the class Discord here. I'm going to use a lot of these today. First off, I'll probably just use UE4images.zip, and then I'll use shanti.zip. I'll probably eventually get around to the FBX files. You only really need one. You don't need to get the yeehaw because that's not keyed out yet. We're not going to key anything out until next week. All right, let me download this too. All right. So there's a couple different ways to bring video files into Unreal. If you're making a game or an installation or something and you just want to play a video file, you can do that. That is not what we're going to do in this class, because in this class, it's very important that when we render things out with camera movement, that every frame of video is synced with every frame from the CGI from Unreal. If you bring a movie file into Unreal like we're going to do here in the beginning, it runs on a different clock than when you render out your scene, like we're going to do in a little bit. Why is that a problem? Because it's going to get out of sync. And if you have really particular camera movement, as you're moving your camera around the person standing on green screen or out on the street or wherever, it is essential that it matches up frame by frame by frame with the camera movement coming from Unreal. If it doesn't, the illusion is lost, right? So the way that we're going to do things to start here, we're just going to bring a video file in, and then I'm going to show you how we're going to do it going forward with the timeline. So in a content browser, let's make sure I'm recording. I'm going to go to Add. I'm going to go to Media. I'm going to go to File Media Source. There's a lot of different stuff here that's named very similar. We will use some of this. I'm going to use File Media Source now, but going forward, we want to use Image Media Source when we're actually working on the timeline. I'm actually going to create a new folder for myself too. All right, it's Media, File Media Source. FMS for File Media Source. I don't know what the actual style guide is. So pretty simple menu here. What is the path to your video file? You could also have paths that are web addresses, network addresses, that sort of thing. You can stream in webcams, you can stream in NDI sources, all sorts of stuff like that. If you have a Blackmagic capture card, you could stream in that stuff. But we're just working with a video file for right now. Let me unzip this. So what file format should your images be in? Unreal will recognize pretty much any image format. We work with image sequences in this class. Video files, like an MP4 or something like that. Actually, I'm not even sure if Unreal will load that. I think it will. Maybe not, because you need to get a license for the codec. But we wouldn't want to anyways. MP4s are very compressed, and they're not really for doing things that are live or generative or rendering even. Like rendering an MP4 in Premiere, working on an MP4 footage in Premiere is a lot slower than working on uncompressed high resolution footage. Because MP4 is a delivery format, like a JPEG is a delivery format. It's the internet. It's an internet format that you upload and then you send to your mom, you know, so she can see. She's not looking at your raw files. She's looking at your JPEG or your MP4. Anybody ever do like video with Max MSP or something like that? You know, if you use compressed file formats, you might run into slowdowns. Usually you want to work with something like an MOV file with an animation codec or something like that, or I'm sure there's better codecs now to work with. That was a problem I always ran into when I worked more with Max. Okay, so my files are unzipped. Even though I just told you not to work with compressed file formats, here's a bunch of PNGs, which are fine because they hold transparency, but they're actually not very fast to process with. When we actually start working with footage that we're shooting, we'll work with EXR files. EXR files are a really good, fast file format that is used with VFX. DPX is actually okay as well. But as far as image sequences go, EXRs are great. EXRs can also hold multiple layers, potentially. It's really cool. Getting ahead of ourselves. Oh, you know what? Actually, I don't have a video file, so I'm not going to be able to do this with file media source, unless I could. This is an image sequence. Do I have an MP4 on here? I'm sure I do somewhere. You know what? I'll just download an MP4 real quick. Here's the bunny. You guys know the bunny footage placeholder? This guy? Test videos. All right, let's try this with an MP4. See if it works. All right, so I got the file path here. Go back to Unreal. So next thing that we need to create in Unreal, and this is true whether you're working with a video file or an image sequence. Image media source is image sequences, file media source is video files. So the next thing we need to create is a media player and also a media texture. I like to create the media player first because it will automatically create the media texture for you, unless you like doing the same thing twice. So it asks right here, do you want to create a media texture with it as well? Of course. How else am I supposed to use it? Just renaming my files. Texture, bunny. Good. You know what? How about that? I messed it up. It doesn't like MP4s. Right there. Oh, actually, I clicked on the wrong one. Nope, doesn't like MP4s. So don't do MP4s. If I had a movie file, it would work, or a ProRes file or something like that, it would work. We'll scratch that. Let's just do the image sequence then. So image media source. Image media source. Image media source. I guess we'll do the Unreal 4 logo again. I'll change these names to not to be the bunny. So every time that we bring video footage in, you're going to have to do this setup. You're going to have an image media source file, a media player, and a media texture. Media players you can share video footage across a single media player. but in this case, we just have one. So open up the image media source, and it's going to ask us what is the path to our image sequence. I'm going to go and get the Unreal images that I gave you. Oh, one other thing to note, because I made a folder here called Proxy. Maybe your computer can't handle your 8K red footage that you shot because it's trying to play it back at 60 frames a second. So render a smaller resolution version of it and use a proxy version as a placeholder until you're ready to do your final render out. Okay? What is proxy footage? It's just lower resolution footage. So I think this one is not even that big, 720p, and then this version is 360p. I think I can handle the 720. All right. Good to go. Let's open up our media player. There's a couple different, Unreal recognizes that I have a couple different media sources here. The one that doesn't work, and then I have another one from another project that apparently I worked on in this project, and then IMS UE4, which is this one. And it plays. Buffers pretty well on this laptop. But just note that if you try to play back the video footage here while you have all the stuff going on in your level, once we place it in there, things might appear out of sync. They could be out of sync because they actually are out of sync, which is a problem, or it might just be because your computer's lagging a little bit. That would be a good opportunity to render it out, as we'll see here in a minute, and actually see if it's laggy or not. But just a warning. Okay, so I have all this stuff. It's looking good so far. Why don't I get a plane and put it on something? Plane, flip it around. You're going to want to make the plane the same aspect ratio as your video footage. I'm going to right-click the texture. You know, it's a media texture, but it's still a texture. So you can create materials from media textures. Right-click it, create material. Nothing happens, right? It pops up. It might not even pop up sometimes. It might just be black, and you'll freak out. But, oh no, what did I do wrong? And you'll tear everything apart. You click play, nothing happens. So by default, Unreal doesn't allow you to just have all videos playing at all times, because that's really heavy to do. So you have to trigger it somehow. Trigger it with code, trigger it on timeline, have it autoplay, that sort of a thing. If I were to open the media player now and play it while looking at it, it plays because I told it to play, right? You can have it loop, play on open, that sort of stuff. But for our purposes, we are driving everything on a timeline. Let me actually rotate this as well, and also set the aspect ratio. Cool. So if you had an installation or something like that, and somebody walks in front of the camera, their face is detected, boom, in Blueprints, it triggers the trigger that plays this video. We're not doing a lot of programming or blueprints in this class because our lives mostly exist on a timeline in video. But you know, similar sort of thing, you could do that with code as well. So to do this with the timeline, first thing is we need to create one. Easiest way to do that, up here with the clackboard up top, click that, get a drop down. The timeline in Unreal is called a sequence, a level sequence. I'm going to add a level sequence to my level. Level sequence, just call this level sequence video. And now I get a new window down here called sequence, sequencer. And it's empty right now, but it's a timeline that you can put different things into, everything from a media track like what we're going to do with this video to a chair. I could put this chair in here. I could trigger this fire based on a timeline in a keyframe event. I could trigger audio. I could trigger animations. I could drive lights with this with the sequencer with keyframes. Extreme power. I can do that too. Maybe we just all turn on our fans. There's lots of things that we can drive on the sequencer. But let's talk about the video first. Okay. So we've brought in the image sequence, but we didn't actually bring it in. We just referenced it. We linked to it in the image media file, image media sequence. We told it where the file is. We created a media player, which actually allows us to play it. And then we created a texture that's using that media player, and we created a material that is being driven by that texture. All that is just the setup. Now we need to make it actually play in Sequencer. So first thing I'm going to do, just like the content browser, the green button where you add assets, the track button is where we can add different tracks to our sequencer. Tracks can be things like media or a mesh or a light, those sorts of things like I talked about. So I'm going to click on the track button, and I'm going to go to media track. Any track that you put into sequencer, regardless of what it is, on the right side it has that little plus icon. If you click that little plus icon, depending on what type of track it is, it's going to pop up some options. We'll go through a couple different options with some different assets in a second. So this tells me, hey, you have 3 media assets here. Which one do you want to use? I'm going to use the one called UE4 with the UE4 logo on it. And now I have the footage imported into Sequencer. It doesn't come in by default, it comes in at 30 frames, regardless of what the length of your video is. So I don't know how many frames this footage is actually, but can anybody tell me really quickly? Just look. 420 frames. 419 frames. I'll make it 419 frames long, sure. So by default here, you can see that the timeline cuts off at 150. Down in the bottom here, we can set our in point and our out point. And then also the inner number is the number of frames that we're zoomed in on. If you've ever used After Effects or any software with a timeline before, this should make sense. How many frames? 420? 419. Doesn't matter. So 420, when I did that, now I can extend the timeline out to 420, right? I'm going to go ahead and drag. I'm just going to count to 420 or 419. And then we can set the in and out points of our timeline with the little brackets here. In and out brackets. Fairly standard video editing stuff. And then I can drag this track to its appropriate length. If I had a media track and I dragged it longer than its actual length, see this white line that popped up here? That just tells you that the media ended and it's going to loop. Go. Okay, you scrub, nothing happens because there's more setup that you got to do. Now we right click and we go to properties up top. And we have to tell this media track which media texture to use. It's a lot of stuff, I know. You gotta jump through all the hoops. Luckily, I created media texture already. I'm gonna assign it. Now when I scrub, ta-da, hit my spacebar to play. Look at that, beautiful. I'm in the green here. It looks like it's playing back at the appropriate frame rate. But again, it's probably less noticeable now, but when we start to do camera tracking, even getting a frame or two out of sync is going to be, you'll be able to notice it. At least I hope you'll be able to notice it. Maybe it's easier if you don't notice it, because then it's really difficult. But like I was saying earlier, even though it appears in the green right now, it might not actually be playing back at the actual frame rate. So if it looks bad in the timeline, it's either actually bad, which means you need to solve the problem, or two, it's an illusion and it's fine, but you're not going to see it's fine until you render it out and see everything synced up. So just a word of warning, getting a little ahead of ourselves, but don't necessarily take this for the ground truth of what's going to happen. You know, if I imported some really high resolution footage in here, like 8K, I might not be able to play it back smoothly at all. Or if you have a weaker computer, you might not be able to play back this even in real time, or seemingly real time. So just like you brought in your still photos, now we have a video file in here and a very exciting logo for a video file. Let me do the whole thing again and do it with something a little bit more exciting. So I already have these assets already created, so I don't even need to really bother recreating them. I just need to add another image media source. I suppose I could use the same one, but I'm not going to. Image media source. I'm going to bring in the cat this time. Image media source, choose a file path. This footage already has an alpha channel in it. It's already been keyed out. Keyed out for your enjoyment. Now if I go back to the media player, you could have an individual media player for this one too if you wanted to. You know what? Why don't we just do that to hammer it into your heads? Media player. Yes, I want a media texture as well. Media player, Shanti. Shanti's the name of the cat. Uh-oh, what happened? Uh-oh, panic. Are these not named well? Where's the problem? You've never worked with image sequences before. You want them named consecutively. Some programs are very particular about how you name things. Like Maya, for instance, would not like this underscore. It likes periods instead. It pisses me off. is this not working? Oh, okay. I think maybe it was just that video file that was in the folder. It was freaking it out, even though it's not the name at all. Not sure. There we go. It's keyed out. The white fur looks a little crazy right now because the material hasn't been properly made. Good. Let's make a material from that. This material is a little bit different because it actually has transparency. I'm going to play this video and just move it down here so we can see it moving. Yeah. Things always look so funny wrapped on spheres. All right, same thing that we did last week, connecting the alpha channel to opacity, clicking on the big node and changing the blend mode from opaque to translucent. Again, the difference between the two, opacity mask and opacity. Opacity is for more fine detail, in this case, like the cat's fur. Opacity mask would be if something had a harsh edge. Opacity mask is a lot cheaper than opacity. Opacity would be for like glass as well, things that actually have translucency in them. Like the fur here. Because if I did do masked, let's just look at it. If I did do masked, it's going to look really chonky. See that? Always a good reminder to save. Save current level. Okay. So we did all that setup. We got our material ready. Drag another plane in real quick. Flip it around. Video on. It's a little dark because the sun is on the other side. But that's alright. Actually, the hair doesn't look half bad. Especially, this is only a 1024 by 1024 texture. Hair looks pretty good, I think. You might notice that it's kind of hard to tell in this low resolution, but when you work with your video files, you might notice ghosting in them. Looks kind of like motion blur or something like that. What it most likely is the anti-aliasing in Unreal. By default, Unreal uses temporal anti-aliasing, so it's anti-aliasing across multiple frames, so you end up with a blurring that happens. It's a really cheap, efficient way to do anti-aliasing in gaming engines and games. You can change the anti-aliasing in Unreal in the settings to something like FXAA, which is less aggressive, and it will clean that blurring and that smearing up. Oh, you see it a little bit when I don't know, can you see the smearing happen? Especially in her face. Not so, more so when I move. It's not terrible on this one. For our purposes, our goal is to composite externally after the fact in post-production, right? In After Effects, most likely. So maybe that smearing doesn't matter because you're not going to record the video footage in Unreal anyways. You're just using it as a placeholder to line everything up, right? But if it bugs you, or if you are going to do like a screen record and call it a day, the anti-aliasing is something that you'd want to mess with. Okay. So that's playing because I have the media player running. If I close the media player, stops, goes black in this case. If I go back to my sequencer, show where my sequencer went. Where'd you go? Why is it grayed out? Do I have it minimized somewhere? Is it not in the level? No, it is in the level. Oh, it got disconnected somehow. That was weird. Okay. Anyways. So this is another thing that you should know about your level sequence. It actually exists as an actor in your world, too. See, it's actually a little icon right here. So you could have different level sequences in your world if you wanted to. You can also nest level sequences within level sequences too, sort of like you can with compositions in After Effects or sequences in Premiere. I'm going to add another media track. I can actually just click the plus icon and add another one. Drag this out. I'm not sure how many frames that is, much less. Right click on it, properties, assign the media texture. Boom. There it is. So what I was talking about earlier, how it's incredibly important for us with this class and compositing and visual effects that every frame is rendered for every frame. Every time I hit, I guess I can't hit the arrow button, but there we go. Every time I hit the arrow button, it renders out that frame. I could render this video out of Unreal right now, my camera viewport, while playing this stuff. It'd be a very exciting video, probably the second or third best thing I've ever made. But when that renders, what's going to happen is that it's going to render the video footage, and then it's going to render the background, the foreground, any Unreal stuff, right? What can happen if you just use video files and not putting the image sequence on the timeline like this is that the video file will just run on its own clock, like I was saying earlier. And the computer will take as long as it needs to render your Unreal scene. Usually pretty quick, right? But it will take as long as it needs. Meanwhile, the video file is just playing. So it might be rendering frame 1, and the video file has already played this much before it renders frame 2 of your world. So after you finish, you're all excited, you click play on your final video that you rendered out, and your video file is like, just the video footage. The world looks great, but your video footage is all out of sync. Doing it like this, with the image sequence in Sequencer, will keep everything synced up. Because it will not move on to the next frame until it finishes, one frame at a time. So that's how we should do things going forward. Always putting it on the sequencer. And that's true even when we move in a little bit later in the semester and get into match motion and talk about composure. It's the same thing. It's video files on sequencer. Any questions so far? Okay. Let's just keep chipping away at different things here. Well, that's a good thing to bring up. I just went to select the cat, and it's through the smoke, so I'm actually selecting the smoke instead. That can be a real pain in the ass if you don't know how to turn that off. You're like, oh, I have to go over here to select it? Nah, you don't have to do that. You hit the T key on your keyboard. I think it's T. It used to be T. Maybe not anymore. Uh-oh. Did they change it? Does anybody know what they changed it to? No? Where's it at? It is T. Allow translucent selection. Well, you can turn it off here. I know why. It's because she's translucent too. So it's selecting the sky behind her. I'm in a panic up here. That's why it won't select it. Well, that was a bad example to show. Let's do it on a chair instead, okay? Because the chair is not translucent. So now it's just selecting the smoke. I want to select the chair. It won't let me. I don't want to have to go over here and select it. And sometimes you can't. Like if there's fog around everything, you can get really close to the thing and it just won't select. Yeah, I guess you could just go up here and select it, but who wants to do that? You can hit the T key and that will change this allow translucent selection thing. And now it won't select anything that's translucent like the smoke or the fire. It selects the chair in the background. Just a pro tip while we're here. Okay, I guess I need to select the cat manually then. So you can add static meshes to Sequencer. There's a lot of different ways that you can add things to Sequencer. The easiest way is probably just to select it and to drag it in. So just grab onto something in the outliner and drag it in. You can also go to the track button up here, add actor to Sequencer. Oops. Add actor to Sequencer. And then whatever you have selected will pop up here, or you could also just search through your outliner here. A lot of different ways to do the same thing. So this is a static mesh that's in here now. So by default, I get transformation tools, translation, rotation, scale, that sort of stuff that we would expect. I can also get a lot of other things if I click the track button and I go to a static mesh component. I can also do things like hide the actor on a timeline with keyframes. If I click on the plus next to static mesh component, there's all sorts of different stuff that I could do. Basically, all these properties are things that you can change in the details panel over here for the actor. And that's another way that you can do things too. Any property here that has, you see on the right here, the little keyframe icon on the right, any property that has a keyframe box next to it can be animated on the timeline. Well, let's just do something simple for right now. We'll just do a transformation. Thing that you should know about keyframing in Sequencer is this little key button right here. This turns on and off auto keyframing. So if I turn this on, as soon as I move this, if you pay attention right here, as soon as I move this, it's going to lay down a keyframe. At least it should. Maybe I have to start it first. So now if I move to a new time, yeah, just needed to start it. And this works like any keyframing in any software you've done keyframes before. So remember last week we talked about how you can't animate static meshes. You can do this sort of animation with them. Very rudimentary, basic stuff. You can also copy and paste keyframes like you would expect. The frame rate's starting to slow down here. Now you can really see that anti-aliasing on here. See the smearing? It's like glitching out. Can you see it on the TV? A lot of that would be cleaned up by changing the anti-aliasing. It's because I have multiple video files playing. I have that fire. I have the cat moving, starting to slow down the computer. So it's taking a couple more frames per frame to render that. So it's temporal anti-aliasing across that many extra frames. That's why it's starting to smear. So pretty simple. If you want to animate static mesh, we want to animate, I don't know, this fire now that we have it here. So I drag that into my sequencer. And this goes for, this effect here was created in the old, this wasn't created in Niagara, which is Unreal Engine's newer in the last 2 or 3 years particle creator. This is created with the older one. But the idea is the same. You go down here and pick, auto activate. If you turn that off, we don't want it to auto activate. We want it to be activated by either code or by something on a timeline. So let's just go to 60 frames here. Click on the track button for the fire. What's this? Particle system toggle track. Let's try that out. And then it starts when it gets to that keyframe. So I play it, it's going to run into the keyframe right there, the white bar, and it's going to turn on. Depending on your particle effect, maybe they have long intros and stuff. It might not be immediate feedback, and you might freak out. It's all going to depend on what your particle effect is. If your particle effect has a long intro to it, you're not going to see it right away, so you need to adjust your keyframe accordingly. What else do we got? We could bring in, a light. Let's do a light. We could do materials, we could do skeletal meshes, we could do so much stuff. Let's look at this spotlight. So I'm going to drag this into sequencer, spotlight. You can also create folders and stuff in sequencer because this gets really crazy really quickly. So what can we control with the light component here? All of the properties that we can change in the details pretty much. The size of the spotlight cone, the intensity, the color. Let's change the color over time. We'll start with intensity. Maybe we'll just make it go really intense and then really not. I'll just copy and paste these keyframes. Play this. So you could create like a flickering light if you wanted to, or turn on a light really bright at a dramatic moment. Tangentially related. Has anybody ever seen the bright light cat meme? Or the monitor brightness turns on, the cat's just like, ah. You know, does anybody know what I'm talking about? Yeah, of course. Thank you. I know somebody's here for me. I don't know how this escaped my internet travels for, I don't know how, the 2 years that it's been around, but I came across it yesterday and it just made me think of it. I don't know. We'll see if I can find it. Yeah, this guy. You gotta wait for the build. When you accidentally turn your brightness up. Or from dark mode to white mode. If you learn anything in the 15 weeks in this class, it's that. You could do that with sequencer. That's not on my notes here. That's just things just pop into my head. Yeah, so we could change the brightness. I could also change the color. We have RGB values down here. Right now they're all 1, but if I wanted this light to go from pure white to, I don't know, I guess red over time. Oh, I like that magenta. As you would expect. This shouldn't be new or groundbreaking to any of you, I don't think. You should have all worked with keyframes at some point. And it's the same stuff. Same stuff, different software. What else? Oh, this is an important thing. So right now, all of these keyframes have auto interpolation on them, or cubic auto interpolation. If you click on this little box next to the key, let me go back to some keys here. Let me select this key and then click on that little box. It's saying that this key has a cubic interpolation, which means it's smooth interpolation. If you wanted it to not ease in and ease out, you could turn on linear interpolation. You could turn on constant interpolation if you just want it to be on, off, and no in between. So we could do that with the brightness here. If I took these and I turned them into constant keyframes. Why isn't that working? Oh, that menu is to lay down new keyframes. If you want to modify existing keyframes, you need to right-click on them. So if I right-click on them, it says they are cubic. I'll change that to constant. Now they're constant. See, they turned into squares. Square is the universal constant keyframe, or a hold keyframe if you're familiar with After Effects. Bam, 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 bam. In a real-time gaming engine, we don't have to wait. We just change it. We don't have to render it out. It just works. Beautiful. Another really useful thing, if we want to get in the weeds here and kind of nerdy about this, I can select all my keyframes for the intensity. And then if I click the graph right here, this is going to pop up a graph editor or a curve editor, lots of different things in lots of different softwares it's called. But this is a graphical representation of my keyframes. So the horizontal line, the x-axis, is time, and then the y-axis, the vertical axis, is intensity. It looks like the number I settled on was 170 up here, and then 0 at the bottom. Or I guess not 0. 10 is where we start at. We never go to 0 in this case. So it just goes from 0 to 170, 0 to 170. If these weren't hold keyframe, if these weren't constant keyframes, if I undid that, that's what they would look like when they're cubic keyframes. Now you can grab onto these tangent handles, and you could actually just move the keyframes around here if you wanted to. Some people just like working on the 2D timeline where you're just on the timeline, but all the pros work in the curves because you can really see the details of things here. And if you've ever used a graph editor in After Effects, it's the same thing, or a graph editor in Cinema or Maya, even though it might be called like the curve sheet or something like that. A similar sort of thing. They actually, only recently, I think in like 3 years ago, they made the graph editor a lot more powerful in Unreal. Because prior to now, it wasn't that much. It wasn't that easy to use. All right, what else we got? We'll take a break. Oh, we can import a skeletal mesh. So I'm going to import the FBX file that I put in that folder. Here's just some old mocap animations. Did I not download this? Look. There we go. So when you import a skeletal mesh into Unreal, or you import any sort of mesh into Unreal, you're going to get a pop-up. Unreal prefers FBX files. FBX is kind of the general default for a 3D file. It will take an OBJ file, but OBJ files are not as good, just in general. For those of you that use Cinema 4D, you could use, Unreal has a plugin called Datasmith where you can just straight import your entire C4D file and it will come into Unreal. Seemingly untouched, but that's not usually the case. If you have a lot of, I might only be speaking to a couple of you, but if you have a lot of cloners and other sorts of duplicator things that you use in Cinema to really quickly do stuff, that stuff is not going to come straight over into a gaming engine like Unreal. You need to really merge them down into their fundamental meshes. Unreal doesn't understand like a C4D cloner. Anyways, I have a skeletal mesh here. I'll post the skeletal mesh documentation on Discord during break. We won't spend a ton of time talking about importing skeletal meshes, but just a little crash course here. When you import a skeletal meshes have skeletons. They have a joint system that drives the movement of the body around, right? They also have animation. I've never imported this skeleton into Unreal before, so it says none. In this case, none is good. I want it to create a skeleton for me. If I had imported, say I had a 3D model of me, right? And then I had like 10 different animations of myself. I wouldn't need to import a new skeleton 10 times. I would import the skeleton once and then use the same skeleton for the 10 different animations. If that makes sense. We can talk about it more when you run into problems with that. So none is fine, and I also want to import the animations. Always get the question, teacher, why isn't my thing moving? Did you check the toggle box for import animations? 9 times out of 10, that's the answer. It's the other one that is difficult to solve because I don't know what it is. All right, let that import. Depending on how complicated it is, it will come in. A lot of times you'll get a warning about missing smoothing groups. It's usually fine. You see it imported a bunch of stuff here. We have a physics asset. This is a Mixamo mocap animation. We have the skeletal mesh itself, which is pink. The animation, which is green, a little darker green than a material. Physics asset. We don't need to talk about that right now. And then the skeleton itself. So I double click on the animation. Beautiful robot animation. So I can drive this animation on a timeline. I can trigger it on a timeline. I can play it on a timeline, just like what we've done so far. So first thing I'm going to do is just going to import it into my world. Actually, you know what? In this case, I'm going to go ahead and import the other one too. So this is a different model. Or this is a different animation, but it's the same model. It's the same mesh. It's the same skeleton. It's the same character, right? So I don't need to create a new skeleton for it. I want it to use the one that got created for the one that I just imported, which is very poorly named walk-in circle _ skeleton. But regardless, that's the one I want it to use. And it's going to import animations, and I'm going to click import. Now this isn't going to create a new skeleton. It didn't import a new skeleton. It just imported the new animation. And now actually if I open this up, this isn't the most exciting motion capture footage. I can select between these two animations down here because they're using the same skeleton. If I had a walk cycle animation for a Tyrannosaurus Rex and a walk cycle animation for myself, they're different models. So their animations aren't going to be accessible to each other because they're different skeletons. I like to think of myself as a T-Rex, but it's not reality. So in this case, the reason why I imported the two is because I'm going to be able to cut between them and also blend the animations together on the timeline. You know, in a game, you would do all the blending with code, and you would set up all of that. But when we're working with the timeline, we can just do it on the timeline. So I imported my skeletal mesh into my level. I'm going to drag it into my sequencer. You see it doesn't have any animations associated right now. It still cracks me up that they changed the skeletal mesh animation icon to a skeleton. I don't even remember what it was in Unreal Engine 4, but it wasn't a skeleton. Now I'm going to click on the animation tab, click the plus, and it's going to tell me these are the animations that are associated with the skeleton. Which one do you want to add to sequencer? Well, I'll add this one. That's really long, so I'll trim that down a little bit. Then I'll also go in and I'll add the shopping bag one. Maybe I'll place that there. And then maybe I'll add in the walking one again. These animations don't really play very well together, I don't think, but the point is that you can get animations triggered on a timeline. You know, remember the meerkat video that we watched? If you download that project, you will see the meerkat skeletal mesh, and you will see the animations driven on the sequencer, just like this. Same thing. So now I have the walk animation, and then it's going to turn in the other animation, and then it's going to turn back into the walk animation. Let's see what this looks like. It's not blended at all. It's just going to be a hard cut. Boop. Yeah, they don't start in zero position, so they warp around the level. If you had animations that played better together, like going from an idle sequence to a walk sequence or something like that, where they're in the same location, you can do blending in the timeline. And you can do that by dragging the animations over top of each other. If I grab onto this other one right here, and I drag it over top of this other one, see I get this tipped over hourglass looking shape. That's the blend right there. We'll see how this blend looks. It's probably going to warp to the other position. Yep, ice skating a little bit. But if the animations played better together, it would be more of a smooth transition. It's better than a hard cut, I suppose. Like the hard cut that we'll get after this. Boop. Boop. That blending is something that's gotten a lot better recently with Unreal Engine 2. Any questions? There's a lot of other things that we can look at, that we'll look at after we take a break. But before we do that, does anybody have any questions? We're going to also look at animating materials, and we're going to look at animating cameras, and then rendering with the rest of the time today. Scratching the surface of rendering. So we have another class about rendering too. No? All right, let's take a break. See you at 3:45. Anybody that made it on off of the wait list that is new and doesn't know where anything is in this class as far as like the Discord goes? Or do you all know? Okay, let's talk. Suppose that's true if there's anybody that's been here for 3 classes that also doesn't know where anything is. So you're on the Discord.
Yes.
What's your name?
Senke.
Oh yeah, we talked.
Yeah.
We talked a long time ago.
Yeah, over the summer.
Oh wow, you're a real person.
Yep.
I'm a real person. Well, you made it in. I know you were talking about.
And then I saw it. I was on the wait list. I was like 9 in the summer.
What got better?
Yeah.
Well, cool. Welcome. So you're on the Discord. Well, I guess everything is pretty much there then that you need. I've pinned to the top is the syllabus, and we have a Notion website for the syllabus. It's pretty straightforward stuff. The week to week, we're kind of doing week to week project. You were here at first class,
yeah.
So I talked about this already. And then we have the weekly schedule there.
Okay.
You already know all that.
This is what I did.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's linked on the syllabus. Just scroll down a little bit. What else?
Okay.
Sometimes there's slides in class. Those are also linked on the Discord channel. Yeah, you got it. If you're on the Discord channel, you're fine.
Okay,
cool. DM me on Discord if you need help or something.
Okay, cool.
Huh?
Yeah,
Cool. Welcome. Is Senke?
Senke.
Senke. Okay. So turns out that I'm not crazy. You definitely can get MP4s in Unreal Engine. It's weird. Even the sample on the official documentation that you download, it's just for some reason it won't play for me, and I don't know if this is Unreal Engine 5 bug or something. I'm using the sample demo from the documentation, but the weirdest thing is that I can hear it, I just can't see it. So I don't know if maybe it's because I'm running OBS at the same time or screen sharing, but just proving you that I know what I'm doing. We're not going to use MP4s anyways, so it's more just saying. Okay, we're going to look at 3 more things here. We're going to look at animating materials on the timeline, really just scratching the surface and just showing you the concept of it. If you want to dive into that, it's a much deeper dive and really embracing a lot more knowledge about materials in general. And we're going to look at animating cameras, which honestly is less what this class is about, because this class is more about tracking our cameras and then using the camera movement that we actually shot for real life, whether it's on green screen or on a real location. But I'll show you how to keyframe cameras and then show you how to render that video footage out from Unreal. So first things first, let's look at the more difficult one, animating materials. So first things first is I need to create some sort of material. Let's create a material. I don't know, I'll call this animated. I'm not entirely sure what it's going to be animated, but we'll find a texture on here and do something with it. And we'd just start with a basic color, I suppose, to start with. So making a material, you can make things mathematically, or you can use graphic files like actual textures like a texture of bricks or something. I'm just going to use numbers for right now. So if I put a constant in here, it's called an Unreal. Constant is just a constant value. If I plug this into base color, nothing's going to happen because 0 is black, right? We're not going to spend a ton of time designing materials in this class, but I need to set this up. If I change it to a 1, it turns white. If I change it to a 0.5, I think you can guess what it's going to do. Middle gray, or less white, or a little less white. I guess it's not, it's not super linear. But anyways, these are constant values. Most materials that you'll use will have constant values. Like if it was a texture, 2D texture parameter, or not a parameter, I don't want to use parameters yet. Texture sample. Just use whatever textures are in here. We have something like rock texture. Yeah, smooth granite. So if I collect this to the base color, it's going to become that texture, right? Constants and texture samples are fixed things. They are not dynamic. They cannot be procedurally changed. What we can do if we want to actually have some procedural control is that we can create parameters in our materials. We could also do other things, like if we wanted to multiply this rock to make it darker. We can do all sorts of mathematical things to mess with our textures. So this is a 1, but what if I make it a 0? Turns black, right? Same sort of thing. So multiplying it by texture multiplied by 0 is 0, black. So if I wanted to change this value dynamically, either with code, a player steps on the trigger box, turn texture black. Very simple, kind of lame creatively, but something that you can understand, I think, right? The alternative that makes more sense for this class is that reach this point of the timeline, set a keyframe, turn texture black. We can do that. But we can't do that with a constant. We need to use something called a scalar parameter. Scalar parameters are float values, dynamic float values. So they can be changed dynamically. Scalar parameter. And it's going to ask you for a name. So name this something appropriate. I guess I'll call this brightness. Oops, not naming it. Brightness. And then it's also a number. In this case 0. Let me change this back to a 1 and it will become lit up again. If I change this to a 100, it starts to get too bright, right? It starts to clip as I increase it in power. Could do a similar sort of a thing with emissive. If I didn't have I set up a vector parameter. A scalar parameter is a single digit. A vector parameter is 4 digits. RGB and alpha. If I change this vector parameter to red, a similar sort of thing as I increase the brightness. Should probably call this different brightness, emissive brightness. So now that I've done this, I've set up, in this case, well, it's disconnected, but Let's just ignore this for right now. In this case, I've set up two parameters, a parameter for color and a parameter for brightness that is multiplying that color. Now I can go back to Unreal, and if I right-click on this texture or this material, it's going to give me the ability to create an instance of it. Remember we talked about parent-child relationships in materials briefly last week? This is where that comes into play. So creating an instance of this. I'm going to name this MI Animated. If I click this now, instances, you don't get full access to the boxes and lines. Instances only have access to exposed parameters. There we go. I was in a panic. Nothing was popping up. It's because I didn't save my material. Instances only have access to the exposed parameters. Now I can change this on the fly without having to save every single time, like my material. I can change the color. I can change the brightness. I can change whatever sort of parameters that I have set up. I could set up a 2D texture parameter, call this texture, and then I'll plug this into a static switch. It's weird because it's called static switch parameter. It's actually dynamic. Is texture, let's call it. So I can swap out textures in my parameters. I could swap out textures on the timeline. See if this pops up with, oops. If it's not a texture, let's just keep it black, I suppose. If it is a texture, use the texture. If it isn't a texture, use black. By default, this is set to false. If I turn it on, then we get the texture to show through. Exciting. If I save this, now I'll have two more parameters exposed. Is texture, right now it's off, so it doesn't even show the texture. If I expose that, activate it, now I can change the texture. If I turn off my emissive, I can change the texture here to anything. Let's put some bark on here. Grunge texture. We can change it with these properties here. This is nice because you can have a really complex material and then you can iterate on it with all of these different instances. It's also maybe a little less scary for some of your team members that are perhaps more artists than they are back-end programmers. This stuff, not too scary. This stuff could be scary. Not this is pretty simple, but materials can get quite complex. I've made materials for projects, you have to just keep scrolling for days. They have so many properties. So material instances, they're useful in their own right for many different reasons, but the point of this is the sequencer. We need to expose parameters that we can drive dynamically with code or on the timeline. So now that I've created this, I need to put it on something. Let's put it on the ground, I guess. So I'm going to drag this material. Actually, I'm going to use the instance. Drag it, put it on the floor. And then I'm going to drag the floor into my sequencer. Let me get the static mesh component for it. And now I can get the material parameters for element 0. What is element 0? Well, element 0 is the material that it has. You can have meshes that have lots of different materials on them. In this case, this mesh only has one material. I'm not sure. Let's see if I can find a more complex mesh. None of these only have one. Anything in the starter content, maybe? Probably not, because they want to keep it simple. No. Well, you could have lots of different material slots potentially on a mesh. So that's where the elements come in. Element 1, 2, 3, and so on. So sequencer is asking us which element are we changing parameters in? In this case, we're changing it in element 0. So I'm going to go ahead and select element 0. Element 0 is here. Now I click on the parameter button, and it gives me access to different parameters that I can drive on the timeline. I guess I can't switch textures on the timeline, but I can change vector and scalar parameters. That makes sense, I suppose. So if I wanted to, go in here and set the emissive brightness on the timeline. Maybe at 150, I crank this up to 10. So we can drive materials with keyframes. Wow, this looks really toasty with Unreal Engine 5. Look at that glow, man. That's hot. No pun intended. Wouldn't look that good in Unreal Engine 4. You'd have to put a bunch of point lights there to fake that lighting. Emissive materials look great now. So that's how we can animate different material properties. I guess you don't even really need to make an instance, but I always like making instances. They're just simpler, and you get immediate feedback of what it looks like. If you had a really complex material here and you went to change these values, it would stutter for a second and wouldn't be real-time updating. Any questions about this? I know we're glossing over like a huge, potentially mammoth topic, very exciting, in the interest of class time and our goals in this class. But does anybody just have any questions here while I'm freestyling with animated materials? No? Okay. It's similar sort of thing with code, you know, with blueprints. I could have a blueprint that says when the person walks into the trigger box, set that material to that color, brighten it up, change it to that color, flick on the video, spawn the enemies, whatever. All that sort of stuff have happened. All right. Let's look at cameras. So we're using the SynCam actor, SynCamera actor. So you can grab it from here, drag it in. It's invisible right now because I have the G key hit on my keyboard. G for game mode. Ooh, all those lens flares making me excited. So here we have a camera. When you have a camera clicked on, if I drag another one in here, if I click between these two, see a little preview window in the bottom right. Changes to a preview of the camera. There's actually a little push pin here in the bottom right that you can click it so it doesn't disappear when you click on something else. If I click on these people, if I click on this or the sky, it still stays there. Otherwise, it just pops up when you clicked on the camera. Another thing that you can do is, there's a couple different ways to do this. You could right click on the camera and go to Pilot Camera, whatever it's called. I recommend naming your camera something a little bit more descriptive if you have a lot of them. You can also go up to your perspective button. This is just called perspective right now because I'm in perspective mode, but this is really a camera toggle between perspective views, different orthographic views, and any placed cameras that you have in the scene. Brilliant naming conventions here. Camera 1 and camera 3. Not sure what happened to camera 2. If I click this, then I actually get my whole viewport to fill up and look like a camera. While I'm here, I can move around. I am the camera right now. Camera is me. Get some depth of field there. Peek over. Oh, there's a cat over there. I am piloting the camera. This text is on top of each other here, but it says pilot active, and then whatever camera that you're piloting. You click the eject button right there, you will stop piloting. Now I'm just back in the perspective camera, which is the default 3D camera that has nothing to do with your actual scene cameras. So that stays there. I show you this because it's a great way to move your cameras around and line things up. It's a little less abstract than you see camera icon and you move XYZ handles on this little widget here. This is a little more abstract than flying around. You use both. Also, I show you, because you could actually accidentally end up in this viewport, and you might spend a lot of time doing your keyframe for the movement of this camera, and then you're like, oh, I'm driving over here because I got to fix that thing in that chair, because you're still working in the editor when you're in this camera mode. It doesn't lock you out from doing things. And then about 10 minutes later, you realized, oh shit, I've just been moving my camera around and all my keyframes are now fucked up. Be aware that this pilot icon, when you want to be piloting, pilot. When you don't want to be piloting, get out of the plane or the camera. So see, I drove the camera over there now. It's over there. I jump back into the camera and I fly it under the table, and I jump out. Now the camera's under the table. Man, I cannot get over this glow. It looks great. It just works. Lumen. I haven't done too many big projects in Unreal Engine 5 yet. It's still getting used to the interface myself, but this light is just gorgeous. Okay, so I created cameras, but I haven't added them to my sequencer yet, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. Actually, I'm going to put all this stuff in a folder. Right click, move to folder, collapse this stuff, just to give myself a little bit more room. All right, I'm going to take this camera, drag it into sequencer. Pilot active. It's actually looking the opposite way right now. That's fine. I'm going to go into piloting mode on that, and I'm going to create a little camera movement. Now this camera movement is completely with the virtual Unreal Engine camera. The point of this class, though it remains to be seen what y'all want to do for your final projects. Don't worry, you don't need to think about it now. The point of this class is recording real-life footage on green screen with tracking marks, or real-life footage on J Street. Don't need tracking marks because the environment is tracking marks. Tracking that camera in software, bringing that camera into the Unreal Engine, and making some sort of 3D asset stick to the ground on J Street, or taking the person in green screen and putting them in an environment in Unreal Engine and making all the camera movements sync up. If you have a locked off camera and you're not moving the camera at all, well, you don't really need to track the camera if you're not moving it, right? If you're hand holding the camera, if you have the camera on some sort of stabilizer or a big gimbal or a crane or a drone or whatever, you need to track that camera because you need the CG to stick to the surface of things and for all the movements to match up. In this case, we're not dealing with any of that right now at all. We're just using the Unreal Engine's camera. Okay, so completely separate. Will you be using the Unreal Engine's camera to do all the match motion and stuff? No, not really. Not unless you have some scenes in your film that have no camera tracking, which is fine. Your whole films that you make, they don't all have to be match motion and camera tracking. Those can just be the VFX shots, and then you can have ordinary shots as well. But let's look at the camera in Unreal. So some things that you should know. I'm going to drag the other camera in too, so we have two of them. So some things you should know setup-wise. So I have two cameras in here in Sequencer, Camera Actor 1 and Camera Actor 3. On the right side, you still see the little white camera icon, or at least it's white on the top one where it's clicked on. If you select that icon, it's going to look through that camera. Makes sense, right? So if I'm looking through this camera, and I go and I start laying down keyframes, I'm going to start recording keyframes. So click the little keyframe toggle right there, the little dot in the middle. Oops, not constant keyframes. Forgot I changed that. Auto keyframes. Transform. And I'll drag it back here. Pull my camera back. Oh yeah, look at that. Beautiful. If I ejected, actually see the camera track, that little line. There's only two keyframes, so it's just a line segment here. Moved a little bit more, maybe rotate the camera. Now you can see the path that the camera's taking as it moves. If I click back on the other camera, I'm looking through the other camera. Just pretty similar view, actually. Let's move it down here to tell the difference. If I unclick the cameras, I'm not looking through any camera now. It's just my perspective camera, the standard 3D editor camera. It's important to know which camera that you're clicked on and controlling. It may seem like a trivial thing, but it's really easy to get mixed up and be on the wrong camera. So click on the icon, you're on that camera. There's also this thing called the camera cuts track up top. The camera cuts track is actually what gets rendered out when we go through the rendering process. If I click play right now, it just goes to my default camera view, and I guess I'm in the game mode where it puts up mobile controls on my screen for some reason. Ignore those. But it doesn't show me, nothing's happening in Sequencer. None of my videos are playing. My fire's gone. My floor's not changing bright yellow anymore. There's no camera movement. Nothing's happening. That's because I haven't told my level sequence to automatically play. If I went over here to my level sequence and I click autoplay here, now when I click play or render, all that stuff starts to happen, but notice that my cameras still don't get taken over. So it's playing all the other stuff, but my camera is still just like a disembodied thing. It's not animated on a timeline. The reason for that is because we don't have this thing called a camera cuts track. Camera cuts track is, think of it like a director track if you've ever used video editing software before. The director track or the camera cuts track, it takes all of your cameras and cuts between them. It's like, think of like, I don't know, a basketball game or any sporting event, right? Where there's tons of cameras, right? There's a camera pointed at the basket. There's a camera on the basket. There's a camera looking into the audience. There's a wide shot. And then there's some person sitting in the production trailer, the director, that is saying, camera 1, go. Camera 2, go. Camera 3, go. And cutting between them, and that's what we see on the television, right? That's what the camera cut track is. It tells Unreal which camera to cut between. In this case, we have 2 cameras. Most of the time, you'll have 1 camera. But you still need a camera cut track. So to add a camera cut track, we click on the green button. We go to camera cut track, right there. And it's going to ask us, which camera do we want to add here? It's going to add it starting wherever your timeline is set to. So this is where we can start to cut together our exciting Unreal Engine film here. Move it to here. There. So now while this is playing, notice that still my camera has not been activated. That's because I didn't click on the little camera icon here. So just like we activate individual cameras, we activate the camera cut track too. So now I'm looking through the camera cut track, which means I'm going to see any cuts and animation that those cameras that have been assigned to that director track or camera cut track are doing. Second camera, I didn't put any animation on, so that's the boring camera. Now when I click the play button, not that clicking play is something that we really do in here, but you see that it actually does play the camera and everything else that's happening on my sequencer. The play button is actually a good test, so you know what's actually going to be rendered out. Sometimes I'll click play even though I'm not making a game. I'll be like, oh yeah, whoops, forgot to do something because it's not showing me what I'm. It shows you what's going to render out. That's what I'm trying to say. So if you click play and it just doesn't start playing, well, it's probably because you don't have autoplay set. It's probably because you don't have a camera cut track. Let me see if I can mute this so it stops playing. If I click play now, it just sits there, womp womp. And then you walk away, you go get some snacks, you go watch a movie, you come back, and then you just have 2,000 frames of this rendered out, and you realize, I forgot to click camera cut track on here. Happens all the time. Oh, it's because I have it muted. You can also mute tracks too and solo them, just like you can with any video editing software. There we have it back. What else can we do with cameras? We can animate all of their properties. We could have, let's make something a little bit more exciting here now. Let's go back and let's start with this camera. Just start with it here on this avatar. This isn't the most exciting world, I know. We can adjust things like the focus, aperture, focal lengths, all those sorts of things. You could set those. You can also animate those if you wanted to. You could animate the focal length while pulling back the camera to get a vertigo effect if you wanted to. I could change my aperture to change the depth of field. Because these are virtual cameras, we're not confined to the laws of physics. So an f1.2 isn't, there's lenses that go less than 1.2, but you could have a 0.001 aperture if you wanted to, which is impossible. It won't let you do it by default. You have to go into the lens settings and change the minimum f-stop, because what crazy person would want to do less than 1.2? Me, usually. I have a bad habit of usually making my worlds way too small. So when you make things small, you need to, like, an f1.2 is everything in focus, because I made everything too small. So you could change that minimum value there if you wanted to. Sure, why not? 0.1. Let's change the aperture to 0.1. Everything's out of focus now. But that's actually good that everything's out of focus, because now I can show you the focus settings. So you can manually focus things, just like you would with a manual lens. You can actually assign an actor to the camera. So as the camera moves around, you can say, always stay focused at that thing. And you won't have to set any of the numbers. Software will do it automatically. So the camera swoops in and out, and it always is just staying focused on that thing, which is useful sometimes. This is manual focus distance, which you can set. If you click on Draw Debug Focal Plane, it will draw this purple plane, which is your focal plane. So I'm dragging this number, I can see what I'm focused on. Wow, this is really shallow depth of field. It's like the corner of this robot's head is in focus. Let me do a little bit higher aperture. So that's crazy. So now I can focus on that stuff. Focus on that stuff. Maybe I'll mute my beautiful camera movement. Of course, I muted it. I'm having the most beautiful shot under the table. Let's not do that. Let's unmute it. Let's set a keyframe here. Let's just have it focus on not moving. Maybe we'll move this robot back a little bit. So they start out of frame. They come in frame, they come across frame, and we'll just have the video in the background come into focus. This is like an ad for Unreal Engine, apparently. Okay, so I can keyframe manual focus distance here. So set a keyframe there. The robot's going to be in focus. Maybe I'll still have the robot in focus a little bit more. Right there. And then when they go out of frame, and we'll switch the focus to the background. Boop. Pretty straightforward. All this stuff is just Legos. Just mess with the sliders and numbers till you make something cool. And it looks beautiful out of the box. You can change focal length, all that sort of stuff. Other things, there are post-processing settings in here. We'll talk about post-processing in the future, but while you're here, you can mess with them if you want to. There's color grading things and film grain, that sort of stuff. I recommend personally doing color grading for film in post-production. You're going to have a lot more control with Resolve than you will with Unreal Engine. But if you're making a game, obviously it has to stay in Unreal Engine, or if you're doing a live performance, it has to stay in Unreal Engine. I guess it doesn't have to. You could pump the video out and then grade it, whatever. You get the idea. If we had audio, we could add audio track in here. I don't know if there's any audio in this project, but be careful. Well, I always do this, and I pick the one that is like the gun, and the volume is cranked up, and everybody's, holy shit. You pick the nice birds. So I could trigger the birds on the timeline. I wouldn't do audio in Unreal either. I would do that in post-production. Questions about cameras? Yes. Camera Actor's old. It's just kind of an old version. There used to be not the Cinema Camera Actor. The Cinema Camera Actor has a lot more features. I would always use the Cinema Camera Actor. Okay. Let's render things out. I'm going to trim off my workspace here. So why did my video stop playing? Oh, I know why. Because the MP4 thing, remember? There we go. Okay, so that's going to be the video. Very exciting. Oh, what are you doing over here hiding out? Now we're set. Although I guess it's keyframes, so she's going to fly away. Or spin away or something. Oh, great. Yeah, that looks good to me, folks. Very appropriate. Don't forget to save. All right, let's render. So rendering out of Unreal, you can render to image sequences, you can render to video files. I usually suggest rendering to image sequences, especially we're going to start using Exr files, so we're going to be rendering to Exr files. If you really want to, you can render out to ProRes, but you got to turn it on. It's already on for me because I'm a pro. You can also use a DNX HD if you want, but you got to turn that codec on. Otherwise, it's not going to pop up. Full disclosure, I just learned this yesterday, actually. I was freaking out, thinking I couldn't figure out why the ProRes wouldn't pop up in my render settings. It's because I was teaching a class, and we were using Macintoshes. And for some reason, ProRes doesn't pop up on a Mac, even though Apple made the codec. Don't know. But I found a forum thread after class, and sure enough, they're like, yeah, this has been broken for 2 years. I don't know why. It's really unfortunate. So if you're working on a Mac and you want to use ProRes, just know that you can't. I don't know why. It's a bug. Okay, so let's render this out. So we recently switched renderers from what used to be called, I didn't think it was called movie scene capture, but long story short, there used to be an old way to render from Unreal, and that changed about 2 years ago, and they started using the movie render queue. Movie render queue is the default now in Unreal Engine 5, and it's a lot more powerful, and that's what we're going to be using going forward. If you want to, you can still use the legacy version. It still works absolutely fine. It's just less powerful. Or not even powerful, it just has a little less features out of the box. You see, because I turned on the ProRes, I have the ProRes codec there that I can render to. Otherwise, these are the things that I can render to. EXRs, which we'll use a lot in the future. Under no circumstance do I ever recommend you ever rendering out to an AVI. It's going to be way too big for what it is. It's just not smart. Don't do it. I'm guilty of it because prior to having the ability to do ProRes, like, oh, I just want to make a video, man. I don't want to have to bring it in and turn my image sequence into a video. It's a pain in the butt. AVI, I always regret it. It's like a 2-second clip and it's like 500 megabytes. Come on. It's crazy. Well, while we're here, I'll just show you this one too. Let's render ProRes. Might get myself in trouble not having it work though. You can also set, is it 444, 422? Let's not go crazy. This isn't that big of a masterpiece. Set the resolution. But where do you want to save it to? I'll just render this to my desktop. I'm messy like that. And this is the legacy one, so it's much more straightforward. Everything's just right in front of you. But again, this is being retired soon. So we'll look at the other way after this. Read-only output directory. Really interesting. Let's render it to my documents folder. Read-only? What? Whose computer is this? Oh, let's render to T. All right, there we go. T is definitely not read-only. Masterpiece. Okay, open capture folder. What's this? Oh, ignore that. That's something else. I'll actually show you the breakdown for this video in a later class. There's a lot of fucking particle effects going on here. This was tough to do. All in Unreal, all separated out. But lots of stuff going on. You know what? This brat doesn't even appreciate what her dad does. I'm allowed to say that because I'm her dad. I showed her this video and she was like, oh, can I watch Paw Patrol? I guess that's what happens when you grow up with like every video humankind has ever made at the push of a button. I don't appreciate anything. Anyways, let's look at this. Good old VLC playing my ProRes on Windows. Beautiful. Rendered out. Done. So for our purposes, moving forward in the class, like I said, we're going to be using Exr files. We will render out foregrounds separately from backgrounds. We're not there yet. We will do that in the future, absolutely, but not right now. So for your rendering now, you can just render out ProRes if you want, or even an image sequence. Heck, I don't even care if you render it out as JPEG. Image sequence. That's fine for now. Let's look at the movie render queue just while we're here. So movie render queue, it's a little bit more abstract. You open it up and you're confronted with this. And what the hell do I do? Believe me, when I first started using this thing, I had uninstalled and reinstalled Unreal 4.26, I think, is when it first went live, multiple times because I couldn't figure out what the heck I was doing. I didn't know that you could click on this. I didn't know that you could click on this. I knew a little bit, but I was confused. Somebody was trying to help me, and they were like, I don't know, man. Like, it works for me. Yeah, I just didn't know that you could click on this right here. That was it. Something stupid like that. So you click on that, and yeah, not everything is together, so it's a little more confusing. So if I wanted to render out a JPEG sequence, for instance, that's the default. I click on this button. I can add Other things, like I could put the ProRes back in there. I could set up a queue. The power of this thing is that, hence why it's called Movie Render Queue, is you could set up a long queue of things, different renders for different render layers, and then you can go get your sandwich and let it all process. Couldn't really do that with the original one. So we'll render out JPEG sequence and we'll render out ProRes. Not 444. Come on, that's crazy. So you click on the names here and choose other sorts of details. That's all good. Deferred rendering. Yes, I want that. Are you working with stencil layers? That's something we'll talk about in the future, not now. Where are you saving it to? I guess we'll just save it to the default directory. What resolution? Let's do 4K, even though this is only a 1080p laptop. Everything else is good. Other things that you might want to think about. Where's that at in? Settings, output good. If you have like a custom start and an end point that you don't have set in the sequencer already, you can choose that there. That's good for kicking out smaller renders. Click accept. If you have multiple render level sequences, you can select them up there. I don't. The level sequence that I'm using is LS video. It's the one over there. What's the map? So you can set up a pipeline with different maps and different level sequences. You can do a lot more powerful things with the render queue. It's a little overwhelming, to be honest. Make sure everything's set up here. You can control anti-aliasing, how many temporal samples you want. You don't really need to use that right now. Other sorts of things. A lot of this stuff you won't use. Super high resolution shots. Like 16K resolution if you want. Turn that on, turn that on. Change your frame rate if you need to. Okay. Click accept. Another benefit of this is that you could use network rendering if you need to. You don't need to use network rendering, but big studios need to use network rendering. So we click render local, and it should start processing our stuff. It's rendering the ProRes and the JPEG, so it's not quite as instantaneous, and depending on if you cranked up the anti-aliasing settings, this could take a while to render. Like the Meerkat demo, there she comes. The Meerkat demo, they had to crank up the anti-aliasing settings to get that fur really good, so the rendering times were longer. Not as long as they would be in Cinema 4D or Maya, but still not real time. All right, let's go look what we got. Where's this project? Real projects, composure, saved. I just saved it in the default folder. Yep, here's all my JPEGs. There's all my JPEGs. Somewhere in here is the ProRes file, which is basically the same thing that we did with the legacy render. So I recommend using the movie render queue, but if you want to use the other one, you can. We'll probably use both for different purposes in this class. In the old one, it's really obvious if you want to render out separate render passes. Remember we looked at these, the very first part of class? All these things? The old way makes it really easy to render them out. What happened to my menu? So I can go to custom render passes and add a render pass. I want to render out, I don't know, let's try that translucency one, right? I'll render out the final, no, we don't care about the final image. We already saw the final image. Let's do the base color, and let me just make a new folder for this. I'll delete it. Select. So I'm going to render out the base color, which is unlit, and separate translucency alpha, which is should be this white smoky one. Although I don't know if we're going to see them because it's the camera view. Let's cancel out of this for a second. Oh, we'll see them. Yeah, it's right there. Capture, save. Let's go to the folder. Where did it render them to? Interesting. Empty folder. Mystery. Am I not rendering it to the right folder? It's right here. Interesting. It's always something, right? That's what happens when you do live demos. Oh, well that works, but for some reason, maybe this is a bug or something. Custom render passes. Okay, we can do EXRs, that's fine. Maybe this is an Unreal Engine 5 problem or bug. Oh, there we go. So it just wants them to be EXRs now. EXRs, pretty big, 16 megabytes a frame. So here you can see that we rendered out base color, final image. We have a lot of separate translucency alpha. Let's open one of these up. Very cool. Maybe there's no smoke in that shot. Final image. There's the Exr file. Which one was that? Is there smoke in that? Let's pick base color. Oh, we triggered that fire on the timeline to start probably a lot later than the camera movement that we're recording. That's why there's no fire in the, yeah, that's why. Yeah, see the fire, well, the fire starts at 60. Maybe it will get it to work if we just pick a later number. Let's try that. Let's just pick the oldest one. There we go. And then you can use that as a mat for your smoke, for whatever. So this is where we're headed, being able to use these different render layers and stuff. And not so necessary right now. So your assignment for next week is to use Sequencer and do some stuff with it, and to use a camera and to bring in some sort of media source. Pretty much exactly what I did today in class. Think about spending some time building a world and put some sort of video in it. I'm not asking you to shoot custom video. You can if you want to, but you can use whatever video you want. More SpongeBob, I suppose, is fine. Okay. Any questions? This video that's linked here, I think it's really informative too, if you want to get more comfortable with the sequencer. It's not too long. How long is this? Like an hour, 40 minutes? It shows some really amazing stuff for larger projects. Yeah, an hour long. About.
The camera.
This is more game-based, so you know, there's some of the stuff that you can use for this class, but it's mostly based on games. Cool. Any questions? All right. Next week we will talk about green screen and stuff, keying things out, and more talking about mats and compositing. All righty. Have a good week.